Today's train news bonus video is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to tell you a story of slow rot, decades of underinvestment, a brief moment of hope, a sprinkle of incompetence, and a massive fucking shit show. This is the story of Arriva Rail North. But first, let's look back to 2004, when the rail franchises of the North were reshuffled from North West and North East to a single local operator, which became Serco-Abellio Northern Rail, and a regional express operator, which became First Transpennine Express. As far as politicians were concerned, railways in the North were in managed decline. In the 1960s and 70s, lines across the country were closed, leaving city centres like Manchester with a lot of excess capacity, even after several former stations like Central and Exchange were closed. At the turn of the 1990s, services which had been awkwardly split between Piccadilly and Victoria were concentrated at Piccadilly. Victoria itself narrowly escaped closure, but was cut from 18 platforms to 6. Remember this bit, it's important later on. Back to 2004, a decade after the railways were privatised. Electrification of the Transpennine route had been cancelled, so Transpennine Express got a new fleet of 3-car diesel trains instead. The new regional northern franchise was awarded to Serco-Abellio on a no-growth basis, keeping the existing fleet of mostly solid sprinter trains from the 1980s, as well as about 100 pacer trains, cheap crap trains built from bus-type body shells as a temporary stopgap, which were never supposed to run for more than 10 years. These trains were small, cramped, shook violently from side to side, broke down frequently, and were proven to be a huge safety risk after a collision with another train in 1999 crumpled the pacer like a paper cup. These trains were just absurdly bad, so thank God they were quickly removed from service. I mean, could you imagine if they were still in operation, running busy commuter services in the North today? Oh. Not a single new train entered service under Serco-Abellio Northern Rail. The only trains added to the fleet were second-hand Class 319s, inherited from Thameslink from 2015 onwards, when they got brand new Class 700s, like a true younger sibling. The reality of Northern Rail and First Transpennine Express is that they were both far too successful for their own good. Passenger numbers on both franchises soared throughout the 2000s. First asked for more money to lengthen their Class 185 fleet, but the DfT said no, so the trains filled up. By the 2010s, the whole network had gone from terminal decline to significant overcrowding. On Transpennine, the route from Manchester to Scotland, once served by just 2 token trains per day, had proven to be an unexpected hit. Taking advantage of new electrification, which I'll talk about in a moment, 10 new electric trains entered service in 2014. They were 4 cars long. Apart from that, no new trains entered service, but the government did once again begin looking at infrastructure. In the dying days of the new Labour government, after a decade of doing diddly squat, the beginnings of a package of improvements first appeared. The Northern Hub plus Transpennine electrification would add track capacity to absorb this sudden growth of passengers in the north, and do it using clean electric trains too. At the same time, a brand new high-speed route from London to the north, High Speed 2, was announced, as well as electrification of lines across the country, including Great Western and Midland Main lines. It seemed as though the fortunes of rail in the UK really had turned. In 2014, Conservative Chancellor George Osborne announced £1 billion for the Northern Hub, including an initial estimate of £600 million for infrastructure improvements and £400 million for the North West electrification plan. Plans for electrification of the Transpennine route were also revealed. At the same time, the first hints at a whole new high-speed Transpennine route, HS3, appeared, though this would not be for another few decades. The Northern Hub, in the meantime, would see the revival of an old proposal initially known as the Castlefield Curve, linking Piccadilly and Victoria stations in Manchester, allowing some services that had been concentrated at Piccadilly to serve both. Building the Ordsall Chord would allow Transpennine services from Manchester Airport to the northeast to run through Piccadilly and Victoria, thus no longer having to cross the Piccadilly station throat and reverse in the main station shed, reducing track conflicts and freeing up space in the main terminus station. It would also allow for a new Manchester Airport to Calder Valley service, helping to bridge Manchester's north-south divide and improving access to the airport. The aforementioned concentration of services at Manchester Piccadilly created a huge capacity problem on the Castlefield corridor, with a great number of trains squeezed into this narrow section of track between Piccadilly and Deansgate. The Northern Hub would add capacity on this route with 2 new platforms at Manchester Piccadilly, platforms 15 and 16, as well as longer platforms at Oxford Road, plus a new footbridge to make the station fully accessible. New platforms would also add capacity at Liverpool Lime Street, and Manchester Victoria's terminus station would be rebuilt with a new roof, though the track layout wouldn't actually be changed. New platforms were also due to be added at Salford Central. Manchester to Preston, Manchester to Liverpool, Bolton to Wigan, Liverpool to Wigan, Preston to Blackpool, Manchester Victoria to Staley Bridge, and Oxenholme to Windermere would be electrified. Transpennine electrification from Guidebridge and Staley Bridge to Leeds and York would follow soon after. It was all very exciting. In 2016, the Northern and Transpennine franchises were replaced and renewed respectively. Arriva took over Northern and first retained Transpennine Express. Both operators would see new trains on the network. For Northern, a fleet of new diesel and electric Civity trains would enable the replacement of the long-hated Pacers. These new trains would be put on the longer regional services, which would gain their own sub-brand, Northern Connect. Transpennine Express would gain trains capable of 125 miles an hour, including bimodes that could take advantage of electric wires were available, and carriage sets that could be hooked up to electric locomotives when the Transpennine route was eventually electrified. At the same time, direct services would be introduced between Liverpool and Glasgow, and the Liverpool to Newcastle service would be extended through to Edinburgh. Both franchises would see more carriages and more seats, reducing overcrowded and raising the standard of rolling stock. The 21st century had belatedly arrived. Now, as long as the government and Network Rail kept their part of the deal, things would go swimmingly. In late 2016, newly appointed Transport Secretary Chris Grayling looked down at his desk and sighed. All of these big infrastructure projects were going to cost a lot of money. In the south, the Great Western Electrification programme had become a fiasco, with deadlines slipping and prices spiralling. The country had just voted for Brexit, and finances were expected to be tight. Pressure to scrap HS2 was also growing. Something was going to have to give. Darlings were going to have to be killed. Picking up the Infinity Gauntlet, Thanos Grayling snapped his fingers. And so, Midland Mainline electrification was canned. The platforms at Piccadilly disappeared from the agenda. Bolton to Wigan was cancelled, Oxenholme to Windermere was cancelled, and various other schemes were cancelled too. Victoria to Staley Bridge, though not officially cancelled, was sort of forgotten about, as were the platforms at Salford Central. Transpennine electrification was paused, and aspirations for HS3 were quietly dropped. Then, after political pressure, revived under the new name Northern Powerhouse Rail, to be built sometime far enough in the future for the government not to have to worry about it. Despite all this, Transpennine and Northern were expected to press ahead with introducing all the services they had promised. A plucky young rail passenger from Manchester quickly noticed a problem.
It seems as though the current government strategy is to ignore the problem until it goes away, which for frequenters of platforms 13 and 14 at Piccadilly like myself will find rather frustrating. Furthermore, the opening of the Ordsall Cord this December will actually make the capacity problem even worse by diverting more trains through an already congested corridor. No need for new platforms? What the hell are the government thinking?
Earlier in 2016, the Rail Maritime and Transport Union had declared all-out war on Southern Rail over plans to adopt driver-only operation. In early 2017, strike action spread to Northern, even though Northern never actually announced plans to adopt DOO. Strike days saw a huge cut in services, and passengers high on the optimism of the new franchises in 2016 began to realise that the service didn't seem to be improving, but none of them could see what was to come. The long-awaited Ordsall Cord opened in December 2017, though at first no trains apart from a 2-hourly token extension of the Bradford to Manchester Victoria service actually used it. With the delayed electrification of the Manchester to Preston to Blackpool route due to be completed early the following year, Northern and Transpennine were planning the bulk of their big changes in May 2018. But behind closed doors, problems were emerging. Northern were facing a severe driver shortage, and training drivers on the new routes was going to take time. Northern were also suffering a shortage of trains. Although the new trains ordered in 2016 weren't due to start appearing until December that year, Northern had been due to receive second-hand trains from Great Western and ScotRail. Delayed electrification schemes elsewhere in the country meant that these trains just didn't show up. Capacity was also a major issue, especially at Manchester Piccadilly, where more trains were set to run through the already crowded platforms 13 and 14. The now increasingly frustrated rail passenger and sexy train news presenter from Manchester pointed this out again.
Perhaps TransPennine Express are hesitant to put trains on the cord, therefore pushing more trains through platforms 13 and 14 at Piccadilly. Because somebody decided that we don't need more platforms.
And again.
But now that it's been built, all of Manchester's rail capacity problems have been solved, right? Wrong.
And again.
The DfT and Network Rail's failure to fund and build new platforms at Piccadilly and quadruple the route to Oxford Road.
But nobody else in the country seemed to notice the problem. And then, when things were already looking dicey, Network Rail announced that the so-called Bolton-Chorley-Preston line, so-called by me because I made that name up and it became a meme, would not in fact be electrified in time for May 2018. Northern, which had been planning to run a bunch of electric trains on that route, went oh shit, and had to redraw their timetable at the last minute. With diesel trains having to be drafted in to operate the route, the existing diesel shortage suddenly became a lot worse. The May 2018 timetable change was a total, absolute, complete, unmitigated fucking disaster. A hastily stitched up timetable that was already a mess on paper proved completely impossible to operate. All the staff and trains were in the wrong places, the through section at Piccadilly simply couldn't cope, and the service descended into farce. Passengers waited hours for trains to turn up, communication was non-existent, and an emergency timetable had to be introduced, axing many of the new services as well as all services on the Windermere line. Aw, poor Windermere. Across the north, the problems that had been building up for years were laid bare. Political attention was turned to the North's rail network for the first time in a while, with Labour capitalising on the occasion to argue for nationalising the whole thing, while the Conservatives went into damage control mode. Chris Grayling faced calls to resign. Improving services on Northern is now our #1 priority, he said. Northern would see rapid improvement. Like hell. New services that were deferred ahead of May 2018, like Manchester Airport to Bradford, were kicked into the long grass. In December 2018, Northern and TransPennine timetables were tweaked and things got a little better, but many problems remained. The staff shortage had become chronic, especially on Sundays when rest day working rules meant that there was simply not enough staff to run the network. From May 2018 onwards, Northern ran a skeleton service every single Sunday. Adding to the now weekly strike action every Saturday, this meant that although services gradually recovered during the week, Northern was left entirely without a dependable weekend service. And, seemingly to the surprise of Chris Grayling, the problem at Manchester Piccadilly hadn't magically gone away. Still, at least those new trains would arrive soon, right? Both Northern and TransPennine were expecting to see the first new trains enter service in 2018, but few arrived and those that did faced technical problems. In the end, the first Northern civities didn't enter service until July 2019, and TransPennine's fleet expansion didn't get underway until autumn that year. Services like Leeds to Chester and Liverpool to Glasgow thus had to be deferred. On the other hand, in early 2019, electric services on the Bolton-Chorley-Preston line could finally begin, freeing up diesel trains for use elsewhere. Trains from ScotRail and Great Western, meanwhile, had been slowly trickling in since mid-2018. Things were slowly getting better, but the decline of the franchise was a long way past the point of no return. Northern never recovered from May 2018. Despite those who wish to renationalise train operators claiming that privatisation allows companies to make huge profits while passengers suffer, this is in reality becoming less and less the case. In 2018, Virgin Trains East Coast was left to default after its parent companies decided it wasn't worth the hassle, and so the Department for Transport had to step in to operate the franchise itself. In the case of Northern, the deal signed in 2016 was well and truly dead. The infrastructure hadn't been delivered, passenger growth had slowed down, and the franchise just wasn't making money. At the same time, the company had become universally hated by the public and made for an easy political punching bag. The Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, had been calling for the franchise to be stripped for over a year. Newly appointed Transport Secretary Grant Shapps was faced with a choice: give Arriva a new, cheaper contract, or step in and nationalise the franchise. Given Northern's reputation, the former would probably have been political suicide. As you can probably guess, I'm not of the mind that simply nationalising the service is going to magically fix all the problems I've discussed. Whether it's the infrastructure owned by the already nationalised Network Rail, the new infrastructure that was canned by the government, the train shortage, driver shortage, or strike action, none of these things are inherently the result of the privatised train operation system set up in 1994. I'm not saying that Arriva did a good job, by the way, because, let's be honest, they absolutely did not, but that doesn't mean a nationalised operator wouldn't have faced the same problems or made the same mistakes. That being said, passengers will see improvements with the new franchise. One, because some of the improvements are happening anyway, and two, because now the government don't have a private operator to blame when things go wrong, they have more of an incentive to make the service work. Earlier this year, strike action ended as Northern and the RMT finally agreed to negotiate a deal on guards. It now looks as though a deal with driver union ASLEF on Sunday working is set to be thrashed out. New Civity trains are still entering service, improving the rolling stock shortage and allowing Northern passengers on some routes to experience something they haven't experienced in decades: actually new trains. Though some Pacer trains are admittedly still running, all will be gone by the end of the year. As for Piccadilly, it doesn't look likely that platforms 15 and 16 will be built anytime soon, though it should be mentioned that the aforementioned YouTuber, commuter and handsome devil has started a campaign to get them built, which may or may not have succeeded in getting a certain Manchester mayor and a few MPs to start caring about it.
We were promised a new platform at Manchester Piccadilly way back in 2014.
In the meantime, it looks as though services on that corridor will be temporarily cut so that trains can actually be operated. So that's where we are now. Boris Johnson's new government, fresh from a stonking election victory partially on the back of voters from the north of England, now has a mandate to at least pretend to want to fix Northern Rail. Will that mean real change or another decade of inaction? Only time will tell. In the meantime, Northern Trains Limited, a fully government-owned train operator, has taken over the franchise, and to them I say, good luck, you'll need it.